7 weeks ago, the day before Boris Johnson announced the UK lockdown, I wrote and recorded some of my thoughts on art in the time of COVID-19. The subsequent time has been very challenging both personally and creatively, so I'm writing this statement without consulting the first to see if my ideas have managed to develop at all. I've been finding it really difficult to think about and connect to art. I wish I felt like I had more access to it, but I can barely tell what art is at the best of times, and now that we live in squares and rectangles, it feels totally elusive to me. I'm hoping that writing this might help me to connect to it again, or at least maybe point to a direction for where to look. The question of art's validity seems to have been a recurring theme for me, both in terms of justifying why art actually matters, but also in understanding its purpose. Art's significance is intangible in a lot of ways. Art objects take on great emotional weight and heightened monetary value due to the invisible concept of cultural currency, but the act of making art itself often exists outside of our typical understanding of capitalist utility. This intangibility has been particularly hard to frame in a situation of such heightened tangibility, where people can't go to loved ones' funerals, are losing their jobs, and haven't really been able to leave the house for 2 months. For people outside of creative circles, art has had the tendency to be defined as a luxury, or an accessory to our society, as opposed to an integral part of its function. And this perceived self-indulgence is morphing into an existential threat as swathes of creative industries now find themselves on the verge of collapse. Whilst I see an obvious hypocrisy in singularly asking art to justify itself when things like the stock market don't have to, the stakes for art's justification have never been higher. I've been really intensely experiencing this question of art's validity within myself, finding that being isolated from a creative community exacerbates my imposter syndrome, the feeling that I'm not someone that has the right to make art. It goes without saying that I understand how elitist that idea is. However, being alone with myself has really manifested in an experience of feeling alone with art, and has led to uncomfortable levels of personal scrutiny. This, combined with the problematic social conception of isolation as being a competition for productivity, has had a very detrimental impact on my confidence in my work. Artists, especially young ones, are heavily reliant on their peers to validate what art is and means. And whilst there hasn't necessarily been a total loss of creative community, it's been greatly diminished. Everyone seems to be finding themselves in a very self-questioning space. When we don't feel capable of conceptualizing our own practice or output, it makes it much harder to understand and support each other with that task. I think this confusion has been worsened by the general confusion surrounding the situation of art right now, which has become a sort of elephant in the room that no one knows how to talk about. Whilst galleries have done their best to adjust to the circumstances, utilizing digital space in new ways to increase accessibility to varying degrees of effectiveness, the implication seems to be that these measures are firmly temporary. It doesn't feel like the institutions have grasped the magnitude of the impending economic shock or tried in any sustained way to surmount the distance between a viewer and an artwork on a screen. It really feels like we're all, institutions included, just waiting for our minds and work to catch up to the circumstances. But is this even possible? Surely if you're trying to catch up to something, you'll always be left one step behind. But even trying to craft a new relationship to art would feel so futile right now, given that everything is so uncertain. The nature of coronavirus has also brought up some issues that are highly specific to my work. I've had a sustained creative interest in social space, in the way that humans relate to it, but also in what our performance of our social selves reveals about the type of world we interact to create. Needless to say, a situation like this, where society has totally flipped its function, has sort of left me reeling. In a sense, I could view this virus as having really opened up my practice, when the physical proximity that we previously took for granted becomes this existential threat. Even the act of being in a crowd becomes unbelievably emotionally charged. That emotion fulfills the role I wanted my art to achieve in a better way than I could ever hope for it to. This change of situation is forcing me to look at new questions, even though it's really hard to even take them seriously as realities, given the mystery our future is shrouded in. What new social space has this virus created? What will conventional social space and our relationship to it start to mean? Will we all just go back to living in our heads alongside each other again? What would it mean if we did? Even moving away from the issue of space, the terror of this crisis has really deeply shaken a lot of people, and it will inevitably have an impact on our social identities. Suddenly, social situations will be imbued with a pressure and anxiety most of us haven't experienced since the age of 15. So, this begs the question, how will our performances of identities change? Will I be changed? I really can't have an answer to that yet. The worrying thing about all these questions is that it might take years to answer them. In writing this, I'm trying to look at the reality of unbelievable suffering we've been experiencing with the most optimistic lens possible. Over 300,000 people have died from this virus, and the last thing I want to be doing is talk about it in that horribly removed art kind of way. However, I also want to hope that artists can have a significant role to play in the social healing that will be necessary once, eventually, we create our new normal. From that perspective, maybe this situation can finally force artists to take on the social role that I feel we've been neglecting for so long. What if art took this opportunity to recast itself as a necessity instead of a luxury? To start making work relevant to people instead of collectors? Perhaps the obliteration of conventional gallery space I was talking about earlier is the moment I've been dreaming of where art finally has space to define itself away from the market. We have a huge opportunity to demystify the mechanisms of artistic creation and distribution, and I'm worried that if we don't take it, some people will write off art forever. I really wish that I could be answering more of the questions I'm posing, but all of them still feel hypothetical somehow. I guess all I can say is that if artists have the strength to really push ourselves through this, we have the biggest opportunity possible. I mean, it's literally not unfeasible at this point that capitalism will collapse. In the UK alone, the economy is expected to shrink by 30%, 5 times more than in 2008. I hope everyone's staying strong and looking after themselves. Even though we have no idea what's waiting for us, this phase will eventually end. And I personally can't wait to be having these sorts of conversations with you all in person again.